Hey Steve, what's going on?
Hey man, what's up?
Freeland was saying that we should have a camera ready because if anybody calls in and runs out of gas, we're gonna go look at it. Someone called in, they ran out of gas, and he's off today, so you wanna go check it out with me?
You're kidding me. All right, man. Let's go do it. Man, out of gas in this kind of heat must be an Aggie. Can you believe that?
Pretty crazy, isn't it?
Oh man. You'd think the guy would at least taken a can of gas with him.
That's common sense, isn't it?
You'd think so, but look, by a fire hydrant too.
Hey guys. I told ya, I never turn down a challenge. Good morning, it's good to see you. Hey, I'll tell you, I'll let you in on the joke, especially if you're our guest. We're finishing up a series today that we've called Running on Empty. And the whole thing started when I used this illustration the very first week. I said, you know, a lot of us have these gas gauges on our car that let us know how far we've got until we're out of gas. And so that's good for some people. And in fact, some of you have been sending pictures all along of you trying to run out of gas and get as close to the edge as you can possibly get. And how far can you go past zero? And what we found is those gauges bring out something in everybody. And for some of you, what that in the pictures that you've sent us, what it's shown is that it brings out this part of you that is a rules follower, that stays just really safe. This is my wife, right? When the thing comes up, and some of you sent me pictures, and you're like, I want in on the challenge, but here's my picture. And so your gas light is on, and it says, we have 72 miles until empty. And you said, that's as far as I can go. I got to pull over. I got to get gas, right? But there are others of us that see the thing that says, hey, you got 5 miles till you're empty. And we think, no, I got way more than 5 miles. Like, I can crank off the air conditioner, and I can roll down the windows, and I can coast for a while. I know I can get 6. And then we get to 6, and we think, well, I know I can make 7 because the line hasn't really moved that much. And it's not showing negative numbers, so surely I'm safe. And I told you the second week when pictures started rolling in, we're going to have a little fun with this. So over the last several weeks, people have been sending in pictures, and you've been posting them on Twitter, and you've been putting them online, and we've got some winners that we're going to award today. And in fact, I want to give you second place and first place because these two guys were so close together and yet so far away from everybody else that you just need to know their story and see their picture. So I think the first one, this is second place. I think we can show you his before and after. There's the before picture. Here's the after picture. That's showing you his rangefinder. Yeah, here's the after picture. I think he ended up making it, just want to make sure I'm telling you the truth here, 58 miles past zero. That's Brian Pope. If you know Brian, Brian's a firefighter, so he had lots of people that could come to his rescue at any point in time. And he did this during Stampede Week. And so what's funny about that is he was driving around in the parking lot trying to get further past zero. He ran out of gas 3 different times in pursuit of the goal. And so his fuel pump is shot, but he's taken home a silver medal. So that's something to be excited about, right? Yeah, give him a hand. But here's the crazy thing. So 58 miles past zero is second place. First place goes to Andrew McGee. And I think Andrew's here. Andrew, are you here? Go ahead and stand up so everybody can cheer for you. Yeah. So here's the funny thing with Andrew. Andrew is going public with his faith today. And so you're going to get to see more about Andrew's story here. Actually, the second service, you'll get to see a little more about Andrew's story in a baptism video that he was late for. Because he ran out of gas. At 64 miles past zero, he coasted into the gas station. So, yeah, give him a hand. That's pretty incredible. So here's what we've said, and if you're our guest, you're kind of going to get in on the gig at the very end. But here's what we've said throughout this whole series. It's really fun, right? It's a challenge when you're running on empty. And you can ask Andrew. He submitted a couple of different entries in our little contest because it's a fun challenge. And for a whole lot of us, we had a blast with the challenge of driving circles around a gas station with our windows down and our air conditioner off, just trying to milk that extra last mile out of our gas tank that we never knew that we could make it. For a whole lot of us, It's a blast. It's a fun challenge. And yet, when it's the story of our life, it's not any fun at all. When the story of our life is running on empty, it's not fun at all. When we feel like God's called us to do something or to be someone or to go somewhere, and yet He hasn't given us enough gas in the tank to get where we feel like He's called us to go, it is no fun at all. In fact, it's terrifying, and some of you have lived this. You've been here as a parent where God's called you and you know God's called you to do something or to live some way or to be somebody as a dad or as a mom in your home, and yet you don't feel like He's given you enough gas in the tank to get to the place that He's called you to go, and it's terrifying, isn't it? Or you feel like God's called you to do something in your job or in your neighborhood, or you feel like He's called you to be someone where you are, wherever it is that you are, and yet you don't feel like you've got the talent or the gifts or the resources or the time or the ability that you need to go where it is that God's called you to go, and you find yourself running on empty. And it's not any fun at all to be running on empty when it's the story of your life. And so we've looked at the life of Elijah. He's a character in the Old Testament. What we've seen of Elijah is that's his story. When you look at Elijah, the story of his success isn't the fact that he was born in the right place at the right time. Elijah was from the middle of nowhere at a really bad time. It's not that he was extraordinarily gifted in the sense that his speeches were just so profound and so eloquent and so great. We have only a couple of his speeches, and there's nothing especially incredible about the speeches except for the times where they occur. It's not that Elijah was a great gifted speaker that God chose to use him. It's not that he had all kinds of money. He was from the middle of nowhere. He was homeless most of his life, and most of the days that he lived through his life, he didn't have enough food to put on the table. And what we've seen through the whole story of Elijah is that's the kind of story of the type of person God loves to use. God doesn't specialize in just using people who come into the deal pre-full. But God tends to use people in this life who find their fullness in Him. That's the story of Elijah. And in fact, last week we saw that the story of a person like that, who finds their fullness in Him, who finds their heart filled completely by Him, the story of that kind of person is the kind of story that lives on even beyond their lifetime. And that can go one way or the other. Last week we saw a negative example, a person that found their fullness or looked for fullness in all the wrong places. And we saw a tragic story of a king named Ahab, who looked all over the place for fullness, and he never found it. He died alone, he died miserable, he died without anything, and he died in disgrace. And he left his son the opportunity to make the exact same mistakes he made. And we saw his son do exactly what his dad had done, and try to seek fullness and try to find fullness in the exact same places that his dad looked, and he never did find it. And the moral of the story last week is you leave what you live. But this week, we're going to see a positive example of the exact same moral. That when it comes to our life, when it comes to you and to me, and we run our lives on empty and we don't feel like we've got enough, even then, even still, and maybe even especially then, what we find is that we leave for future generations. We leave for our children. We leave for the people who come after us. We leave what we live. And if that's a life of fullness, we can pass on an extraordinary gift to the people that come after us. See, here's the deal. All of us, we tend to find fullness, or at least search for fullness in all kinds of different places, don't we? We look for relationships to provide fullness. We look towards jobs to provide fullness. We look towards money and stuff to provide fullness. We look towards positions and power to provide fullness. Some of us look towards substances to provide fullness. And yet, so many of you could tell this story, and if we just lined you up across the stage and asked you to come by and tell us your story, what you would say is, I search for fullness in relationship, and I've been in relationship after relationship after relationship, and it's not found there, right? Like, I looked for fullness in my stuff, and I made my first million, and I lost it. And so I went searching for more because I felt like if I could just have 2 million, then I would be foolproof, and I lost it. And so I went after 3 million, and I've searched, and you can't find fullness there. You can't find it in your job. You can't find it in relationships. You can't find it in the stuff that you have. Fullness can't be found there. It's like drinking salt water when you're at the ocean, and it's hot, and it's deceptive because the salt water looks like it would be refreshing. It looks like it would provide what it is that we need to be full, and yet what we find is that it leaves us feeling more empty than we ever were before. And some of you, that's your story. In fact, that's even your story today. You'd say, man, I'm in relationship, and this is my 9th relationship this year. And I keep finding that in relationship after relationship, all I find is, this isn't it. I'm not feeling it anymore. It's gone away. I don't see what I thought that I was going to see, and it's changed, and he's changed, and I don't know what's different, but I'm not full. Well, the secret is fullness isn't found there. You never find fullness there, and that's what Elijah's life has shown us. That's not where it's found. And we're going to see that even more today. So if you've got a Bible, turn to 1 Kings chapter 19. If you don't have a Bible, grab one of these that's spread around looks just exactly like this, and turn to page 251 on those. And feel free to take that one with you if you don't own a Bible or don't own one in a translation that makes sense to you. I want you to be able to read Elijah's whole story and see what it is that God did in his life to allow him to be full even when he was running day after day on empty. What we're going to see is Elijah leave what he lived. But the first thing that I want to show you is something about the guy that he leaves it to. And so in 1 Kings chapter 19, the place that you're turning right now, at this point, Elijah comes into the story right after his most empty time in his life. He thought that God was going to use him for something incredible. He felt like God was calling Elijah to do something that none of his generation, that none of his family had ever been able to do before, in bringing them back to the person of God and to worshiping the one true God. And so Elijah has this showdown with the prophets of all of the false gods. And he comes into this situation, and they are completely humiliated. He calls down fire from heaven, and they're humiliated and then killed. And the moral of the story is there is only one God, and he is powerful, and he should be served above anything else. And Elijah, when he sees the fire come down from heaven, thinks, this is it. Like, this is the moment that I've been working for. This is the time. This is what I thought was going to be what God created me for and prepared me for. And this is the moment. And then when he walks away, what he finds out is, this isn't the moment. That's not what God was going to do. And he finds himself in a cave, and he's depressed and he's discouraged, and he says, God, if this is what it looks like to follow you, I'm out. If this is what it looks like to be used by you, use somebody else, but take my life, because I'm no better than anybody who came before me. And God teaches him a lesson in that point. He says, Elijah, you're right. You're not any better than anybody that came before you. You're empty. The difference is, if you'll find your fullness in me, I'll use you. But I'm going to use you in a way you never imagined. And you're going to have to be okay with that. You're going to have to be okay defining success like I define success, not like you define success. And you're going to have to be okay with allowing me, God says, to accomplish my will my way, not my will your way. And so he says, and beyond that, I'm going to accomplish my will, and I'm going to use you towards it, but I'm going to do something even after you're gone. And I'm going to raise up people after you're gone to bring what I've promised to be. And one of the guys that he names in the list of people that he's going to raise up, that Elijah should go and commission, is a man whose name might also be familiar to you. His name is Elisha. And we pick up this story as Elijah goes to commission these prophets that God's going to use. And he finds a man named Elisha. We pick up the story in chapter 19, beginning in verse 19. 1 Kings chapter 19, beginning in verse 19. This is what it says. It says, Elijah went from there. That's the cave where God had spoken to him. Found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elijah then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, he said, and then I'll come with you. Go back, Elijah replied. What have I done to you? So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat, and he gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. Here's what you need to know about Elisha, because this doesn't necessarily translate really well to a 21st century context. If I was to tell you, hey, I got a friend, and he has 12 yoke of oxen, and he drives the 12th one, you would say, sounds like a guy that needs to get a life. What they would see in a person that read this for the very first time, when this passage said Elisha was a guy that had 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself drove the last pair, they would have thought, wow, he's a Renaissance man. You see, here's what that said. In Elisha's time, most people couldn't afford to own a single ox. much less 24 oxen. This passage implies that Elisha owns 24 oxen, that he has the land and the business operation to need 24 oxen to plow, and that he's been able to hire 11 guys to drive 11 of these different yoke of oxen. So Elisha is a man with extraordinary means for his time. Elisha is a man that's incredibly rich, and people would have seen that. But not only that, it says he's driving the 12th pair of oxen, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? If this guy has all of this money and he's got all of this land and all of this property and he can afford to pay 11 guys to drive 11 pairs of oxen, wouldn't you think he'd be able to afford to pay a 12th guy to drive that 12th pair of oxen? I mean, at this point, he's just kind of showing off. He's in it for the game. He drives the oxen because he's got some talent beyond just his means. So here's what it would translate. If I was to come to you and I was to say, I went and I found a friend of mine, and he owned 24 different companies. And one of those companies, he was the chairman and the CEO. You would say, wow, that's amazing. That's a guy that can do everything. That's what people would have seen when they saw this story about Elisha. And so Elijah goes to this Renaissance man, this incredibly wealthy, talented guy, and he takes off his garment that has gone with him everywhere he went. And there's dispute as to what kind of garment it was. It could have been the hairy garment that we talked about last week that Elijah wore everywhere he goes. But whatever it is, he takes this garment that he's been wearing that has to be filthy, stinky, rank, and he takes it off and he throws it over the shoulders of this rich, wealthy man that's plowing with his oxen, Elisha. And then he walks away. And we know he walks away because we find out what Elisha does. Elisha turns around and he goes running after Elijah. What Elijah's done when he took off his cloak and he laid it on the shoulders of this man is he said symbolically, "You're going to get to do what I've been doing." Which seems a little crazy, doesn't it? Imagine you worked for one of the 24 companies. Can you imagine going to the CEO of one of those companies, or to the person that was the primary shareholder at all of those companies and throwing your coat on him and saying, "Hey, you know what? Someday you're going to get to do what I do." That's essentially what Elijah's done for Elisha. He threw this garment on and he said, essentially, you're going to get to run around without any comfort. You're going to get to live a life where you're constantly on the run with fear. You may get to live a life where you don't have any food, you don't have any water, and you're completely dependent on God to take care of every need you have. Congratulations, Elisha. This is your life. And Elisha puts down what he's doing, and he runs after Elijah. And we get a glimpse that Elisha knows what he's in for, because he says to Elijah, "Before I go, let me go kiss my mom and dad goodbye." He knows that this place that he's going is probably going to mean he's never coming back. And he says to Elijah, "Elijah, let me go kiss mom and dad goodbye." And Elijah says, "What have I done to you? Like, this isn't my idea. My idea was the fire down from heaven. You are God's idea. I don't care. You take it up with him. You go do whatever you want. I'm just doing what he told me to do. Here I am. Here's my coat. You can do what I want to do if you want, but you take as long as you want, because this is between you and God. This isn't my deal." And so Elisha goes home. And he goes and do you see what he does? He takes all of his oxen. This is an extraordinary expense that these oxen would have cost him, and he slaughters them. And then he takes all of his plows and all of his equipment that he's used on this land to plow his land, and he chops it up into little pieces and starts a fire with it. And he burns these oxen for dinner and invites everybody around to come for the feast. You see what Elisha's just done in this moment? He's just gone public with his faith. He's making sure that everybody he knows that he knows what he knows. And so he goes to all of these people and shows them where he thinks fullness is not found. And you see, because he's willing to go back to all of those things that you and I might tend to run to for fullness. And he slaughters them. He kisses them goodbye. He burns them up. And he throws a party. for everybody around him to come see. Don't misunderstand. The point of this story and the point of Elisha's story isn't that if you've got wealth or if you've got talent or if you've got relationships or if you've got stuff that you're going to have to throw them all away in order to be filled with what God wants to fill you with, have a heart that's fully his. There are plenty of examples of Scripture where that's not the case. There are also plenty of examples in Scripture where that is the case. And that is what God calls a person to do, where their stuff or their relationship stands in the way of them being able to follow where God's called them to go. The point isn't that Elisha gave them up. The point is that he saw their true value. And he saw their true value in contrast to what God was calling him to do. And in this case, God called him to something great. And Elisha saw that that was of incredible value compared to the stuff that he would leave behind. He's trusting God to provide enough for the next step in the journey. See, we see in this Elisha's heart. And it's a heart that believed beyond anything else, and if you're taking notes, you can write this down, that nothing fulfills like a heart he fills. Nothing fulfills like a heart he fills. Elisha gets the offer to carry on Elijah's ministry, to be used by God for incredible things, to be the mouthpiece for the Jewish people, to be the person who speaks on behalf of God and gets to see God show up in incredible ways through him, and yet he knows that he can't do that and this at the same time. And so when he compares the values, he realizes fullness isn't found in my job. Fullness isn't found in my stuff. Fullness isn't found in my relationships. Fullness is only found in a heart he fills. Nothing fulfills like that. There is nothing greater than that. And Elisha literally goes running after the opportunity. And he doesn't do it begrudgingly. You saw what he did. He throws a party. And he invites everybody to see what it is that God's doing in his life. This morning, some of you need this courage. Because the truth is, and come on, there's a relationship in your life that's holding you back from following God where he told you to go. Some of you are dating. You're in a dating relationship that you know right now where you're sitting is holding you back from going where God's called you to go. Some of you have hobbies that you know they're holding you back from the place that God's called you to go. And they may not be wrong. They may not be sinful. There is nothing inherently wrong or sinful about pulling a plow. But in Elijah's case, he knew that he couldn't continue doing what he was doing and go where God called him to go. And in that moment, he made a decision that for him was a no-brainer when he said, nothing fulfills like a heart he fills. And he throws a party and he walks away. Elisha doesn't see the other stuff as stuff to be held on to. He sees it as stuff to be leveraged as he goes public with a reflection of his faith. And he invites as many people as possible to be a part of the party. What a cool way to think about your job, right? What a cool way to think about your stuff, the relationships that you have. Not as stuff to be pursued so that you can be full, but as tools that God's given you so that you can reflect who he is and where it is that you find your fullness. See, losing all of his stuff didn't make Elisha empty. In fact, it showed that he was full because he was willing to walk away in pursuit of something that he perceived to be of even greater value. Becoming Elijah's servant. He served Elijah for several years before the tangible payoff. And in fact, we see the payoff in Elisha's ministry, and we see the payoff of Elijah's fullness in 2 Kings chapter 2. So if you got your Bible still open, flip over to 2 Kings chapter 2 or page 252 in these chair Bibles as we see the end of Elijah's story and the beginning of Elisha's furtherance of his ministry. Look at Elisha followed Elijah. He followed him for several years. And God, at this point where we pick up the story, has revealed to Elijah and to Elisha and all of the prophets that serve God that this is going to be the last day that Elijah walks on the planet. It's the last day of his life. He's lived a full life, even though he hasn't always been full. Because day after day in Elijah's life, God's provided for him enough. When God called him away to the brook out in the middle of nowhere, God gave him enough to make it to a widow's house where he ran out of food. And God gave him enough to make it to the showdown with the prophets of Baal. And God gave him enough to make it to the next spot as he ran for his life. And all along the path, Elijah's lived a life that's full, even when he was running on empty. In fact, so full that when we pick up the story in 2 Kings chapter 2, the life of Elijah that was spent running on empty overflows into the life of another person. I want you to see how the life of a full person overflows. Look at 2 Kings chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. 2 Kings chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you alone." So they went down to Bethel. Isn't that incredible? Elijah's lived his whole life alone, on the run in the middle of nowhere. And at the end of his life, God gives him a friend who will not leave him alone. His story goes on, verse 3. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" So this company of people, there were prophets in all of these different towns that they would go for training and for encouragement. Think seminary or graduate kind of school for people that would serve as prophets. And they come out to Elijah and to Elisha and they say, "Hey, have you heard? Because God revealed to us today, God's going to take Elijah away." And Elisha says, "Yes, I know." Elisha replies, "So be quiet. I don't want to talk about it." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And Elisha responds, "As surely as the Lord lives and you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, "Did you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," he replied, "so be quiet. I don't want to talk about it." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. And Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. What an incredible demonstration of power. And if you're familiar at all with the story of the Bible, you know exactly the point that God is trying to make to everybody who's watching at this point. He's making a point to say the same God that was with Moses when Moses led a group of people across a body of water on dry land, the same God who was with Joshua when Joshua led a group of people across this very same body of water on dry land, that same God is with Elijah. And Elijah strikes the water, and the water separates, and they walk across on dry land. And verse 9 says, when they'd crossed, Elijah says to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I'm taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. Now stop for just a second. You see what Elisha just asked for? This is insane, isn't it? This is the guy that has come from everything with the riches and the relationship and the power, and he asks Elijah for the blessing of the firstborn son. And you understand, in this time when the father was about to die, he would give the firstborn son a blessing. And it would be a double portion. It would be some extra inheritance, not just because it was going to be good for him, not just to set him for life, but because when he gave him an extra part of the inheritance, he gave him an extra part of the responsibility. And the firstborn son was the one responsible for taking care of mom. The firstborn son was the one responsible for taking care of baby brother. The firstborn son was the one who would shoulder the load of the family, which those of you who shoulder the load for your family know is a heavy load to shoulder. And Elisha says to Elijah, if serving God with these people means being homeless for the rest of my life like you were, if serving these people in the name of God, if going forward with the message of the God who serves and the message of God who is good, if it means going without food for the rest of my life, if it means not having relationships, if it means being lonely and following you, I want double, because there's nothing greater than being a part of what happens when God uses a person. So Elijah, I'll shoulder the load. I want the blessing of the sun. I'll run on empty because I can always trust God for enough. The story continues. Elijah says to him, "You've asked for a difficult thing. Do you know what this means, Elisha?" Yet Elijah says, "If you see me when I'm taken from you, it'll be yours. Otherwise, it will not." And as they were walking along and talking to one another, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Now, isn't that the way God deals with his faithful servants? You remember back in 1 Kings 19? Elijah thought that God was going to live out his great purpose in Elijah's life by sending fire from heaven so that the people would see it. And at the end of Elijah's life, God sends fire from heaven and takes Elijah up. And the people watch what happens to Elijah. Elisha saw this, verse 12, and cried out, "My father, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel." And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his garment and he ripped it in two. Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him, went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. You know what he's asking? God, I'm empty. I don't have what it takes. I can't go the distance. I can't make it without the God, the Spirit of Elijah. So God, here I am. Where are you? Look what he does. He struck the water. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and he struck the water with it. It says, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. And when he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left. And he crossed over. And the legacy goes on. And the ministry goes on. And God picks up where he left off with Elijah. The God who was with Moses and Joshua and Elijah is now with Elisha. See, Elijah lived his whole life running on empty. But at the end of his life, after God provided enough, time after time after a time, there was enough to spill over into life of somebody else. Here's the exclamation point on Elijah's life. If you're taking notes, write this down. Filled lives leave full legacies. Filled lives leave full legacies. Isn't that one of the greatest gifts that God could give a faithful leader? Work that he could work through someone whose heart is fully his, to the point that he gives them responsibility for something that's so important that it can't die with them. Filled lives leave full legacies. So what about you? Who's coming after you? It may not be as dramatic as Elijah's handoff to Elisha, but who are the people in your life that could look at your life and say, you know, they ran on empty most of their life. They didn't always have the most. They didn't always have the best. They didn't always have the gifts. They weren't always the strongest. But God, if I could be like them, I'd give up everything I have. Who's coming after you? Whose life will your filled life spill over into? Do the people that are coming after you even want what you have? See, this is what I want so bad for you as your pastor. It's why we as a church talk every single week about developing Christ-centered people who make a difference. Because there is nothing greater, nothing more exciting than being a person that says, of all of the things I could have, of all of the things that I could pursue, I want to leverage everything that I have and everything I could pursue in order that God might use me in the life of another person, that God might use my life in the world. And we as a church want to program everything we have towards developing people that we can send out into the world so that they spill over into the lives of other people. And that there would be people in your neighborhood, people in your house, people at work with you, people where you play golf, people where you pursue hobbies that would look at your life and say, I can't really put my finger on it. It doesn't make any sense. But God, if I could have what they have, I'd give up everything I have.